Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoy this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. Welcome to episode 8 of the 4th season of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby. A primary part of our mission at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence is advocating on behalf of public policy that supports survivors of domestic and sexual violence and that supports advocacy organizations. The 2025 legislative session wrapped up in May, and new Missouri laws go into effect on August 28, 2025. In our episode today, we will discuss the previous legislative session, new laws that were passed, and policy efforts that are happening at the national level as well. For this conversation, we are joined by 3 true powerhouses of the Missouri anti-violence movement: Lisa Fleming, Jessica Woolbright, and Matthew Huffman. Thank you all so much for being here today. As we're getting started, I'd like to start off with just some introductions. Do you all mind telling us who you are, what you do, where you work? And just because we have such a wealth of experience on the call today, if you want to share how many years you've been involved in the anti-violence movement, I would love to hear that as well. Jessica, would you like to go first?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Woolbright. I am the Executive Director at St. Martha's in St. Louis. This year is my 25th year at St. Martha's. Yeah, I started when I was 12. So basically 25 years of experience.
That's significant. Thanks for sharing that. Lisa, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. I am Lisa Fleming. I am the CEO of Rosebrook Center, a domestic violence program in Kansas City. And tomorrow, I will celebrate my 34th anniversary at Rosebrook Center. 34 years ago tomorrow, I started as a shelter advocate working the 4 to midnight and have been here ever since.
That is wonderful. 34 years. Wow. Matthew, would you like to go?
Yeah, thanks, Nora. Really quickly, though, congrats, Jessica and Lisa. 34 years and 25 years is incredible, so congrats on those milestones. My years of experience feel like they pale in comparison. So I'm Matthew Huffman. I'm the Chief Public Affairs Officer at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. This year is my 13th year at the coalition, but I got started before that at my local agency in Columbia, True North. But I really got started doing this work on my college campus whenever I was back at Mizzou. So somewhere around 16 to 17 years.
Holy smokes. All right, we got a lot of years here, a lot of experience in the call. And so I'm just so thankful that you bring all of that experience to making positive policy change happen here in Missouri. In addition to your work at local programs, you are also very involved in the MOCADSV Public Policy Committee, which is a committee of our board of directors. So how do you all describe the Public Policy Committee? And could you also tell us about your role there? Because you all play pretty important roles in the Public Policy Committee. Matthew, would you like to start that one?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Nora, our Public Policy Committee is a standing committee of our board of directors. And we have kind of a unique dynamic setup where all of our board members serve on the Public Policy Committee, but then we also have representatives from member agencies who serve on there as well. And I'm really proud of the fact that over the last few years, the Public Policy Committee has really been invested in building out the governance structure of the committee. So now we have a process of new people applying to be on the committee. We have an orientation for them. We have term limits set up, and then we also have folks who serve on the committee who review those applications when they come in and make recommendations for our board chair on who would be good representatives to then serve on the committee. I really appreciate the fact that they've really been invested in building out that governance structure, because I think it shows a real investment in wanting to bring in new voices, wanting to have really diverse representation on our public policy committee from across the state. And I really look to them during the legislative session and even as we're getting ready for our DC advocacy to be thought partners in our public policy work. So Cheryl and I can be reviewing bills as they're introduced. We can start setting kind of an agenda of what we want to follow and work on. But we also really look to the committee to get their feedback and to think through things on how would this potential law play out in your community, in your work with survivors and their families. So we lean really heavily on them to think about what are the real world examples of how this particular law could play out if it's passed.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I really appreciate the public policy committee members for the origins of this organization. Like we were started by domestic and sexual violence advocacy organizations located throughout Missouri. And the committee, I think, really keeps us centered on what the needs of those organizations are and what the needs of survivors are. And so I can really appreciate the work of the committee in that way as well. Jessica, you co-chair the committee, and Lisa, you've been involved in the committee for a very long time and serve on our executive board. Is there anything else you all would add to the role of the Public Policy Committee in informing our legislative priorities?
I was making myself a note as Matthew was speaking because, quite frankly, I think he nailed it. I don't know. But what I would add is that I think one of the tasks or responsibilities of the Public Policy Committee, and Matthew touched on it a little bit, is really being able to think about the unintended consequences of any issue that we're looking at. And, you know, Lisa and I both represent more urban areas. Yes, we serve people in more rural areas, but thinking about those unintended consequences for the entire state of Missouri. And because what might be a win in St. Louis City could be extremely harmful or detrimental to some of the other agencies in smaller parts of the state. And that's difficult and requires a strategy, but is really, really important.
Yeah, I would underscore it. I had that same thought, is that our role is to, help establish what those priorities are for the entire state for both appropriations and our legislative priorities, but it is thinking through those unintended consequences. I think that was the first lesson I learned way back when. And I remember participating in some of those annual conference discussions about what would be the legislative priority. And I remember it being said, be careful that even well-intended legislation, I think back at that point, it was a legislator, well-intended, wanted to propose mandated reporting on domestic violence. And that on its surface sounded like, well, this is great. This will be a great thing that will be able to help survivors of domestic violence and their children. However, thinking through the unintended consequences that could create a barrier and a threat to those survivors seeking services. So going through that process, and I think that we do that with each of the different pieces of legislation that we look at, and to be able to have all of those different perspectives. And the other thing about setting up that governance of having those term limits, while, we greatly value the tenured and experienced members of a public policy committee, we need to be thinking about the succession planning. And so I think it was a great way to be able to ensure that we have those not only tenured and experienced members, but we're bringing along the advocates, the systems advocates for the future, and giving them an opportunity, like I had so many years ago informally, to be able to learn and to be mentored by that process. So it's, I kudos to the committee and the governance and Matthew and Cheryl for getting it set up, some of those changes that have happened in the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, we are very lucky to stand on some very, very strong shoulders of the women that came before us.
Absolutely. And so beautifully said. I'd never really thought of committee work as leadership development, but it truly is. And you all are extremely busy people. You're leading organizations. Your time is very valuable. And yet you are committed to this work of public policy advancement. Can you speak to where this commitment comes from? Where does your interest in public policy work kind of stay motivated from?
I mean, I don't think you can take policy out of anything that we do. I really come from a framework that you can impact systems, really that shapes how we can go about the impactful work for survivors and their children, how we can improve those systems. It's rooted in our policy. Policies design how are we organized to do our work. And so we can craft those and build collaborations with our community partners, our coordinated community response in order to be able to do that. And so, while funding and our resources to do the job is essential, I think that the policy piece, they go hand in hand. And looking at, our policies and our protocols and linkages and philosophies, that's all built into policies, whether it's at the local level for a coordinated community, how our city, how our states, and how our federal government are responding, and they can really either help and improve that, or they can be a hindrance, they can be a barrier.
Yep. With policy work, we really can see the large scale impact and impact potentially many survivors and organizations. What were you going to add, Jessica?
I wish I could say that I have always loved public policy work and understood the connection from the very first day, but I didn't. When I was a young advocate starting at St. Martha's, I had a lot of pride and maybe even arrogance at some point about, no, I'm a boots on the ground advocate, right? Like, I want to do the work. I want to be in the trenches. I want to be doing, quote unquote, the real work. And the longer you do it, you realize, and maybe some life experience thrown in as well, you can't do the work if you don't have the right policies. You can't get mad at a judge for making a certain decision if he is following the law that your state set. So you start to become aware very quickly of the impact of public policy. And now I find it to be some of the most empowering work that there is, because I walk into Jeff City, and the first time I did it, I was with Michelle Schillerbaker and Colleen Coble. So that's not intimidating enough right there, right? These are the women who have done this. And I remembered telling myself, well, don't let them see that you're scared, right? Fake it until you make it. And then I sort of convinced myself that I knew what I was doing and what I was talking about. And now I walk into the Capitol or the Senate building in DC, and I remind myself that those people work for me. And that it is my responsibility, as well as my privilege, to be able to share the stories of what I have learned from being that boots on the ground. And maybe I don't still have the privilege of doing that, but I see the women that I work with every day that are doing it, and hear the stories and see the trends and see where the disconnect is. To me, it's public or policy, and understanding public policy is just another way to be an advocate. It's not instead of, it's just in addition to.
Yeah. Your point about the talking about the judge and not understanding why did they make this decision, and feeling frustrated or angry or disappointed in that. And it is stepping back and veering away from that blame and shame game that we know does nothing to advance our mission and our advocacy priorities, but to look at, what are the laws that are guiding their decisions. And I think that we all have those. And so when you have a better understanding of that, then you can come to the table with a shared mission and look at it's the policy that is creating the barrier or the threat to safety for survivors and their children, not the person. And a lot of times policy, not always, but most of the time policy, that's something you can do for free. You can change the way in which you go about doing your work, that it doesn't cost anything. It's just, the needs of survivors and their children are ever changing. And so our policies are going to have to keep up with that as well.
For any listeners who may not be familiar with Colleen Coble and Michelle Schillerbaker, Colleen was our primary lobbyist for the coalition for about 34 years. She was our CEO and retired several years ago. And Michelle Schillerbaker was the founder and executive director at St. Martha's Hall for many decades. Matthew, what would you say? And true powerhouses of the movement as well.
Oof, yeah, true powerhouses. And I don't know that I have much to add on to the very eloquent things that Jessica and Lisa had to say. I think for me, my interest in public policy is I've always been really passionate and motivated by public service. And also, those who know me know that I self identify as a public health nerd. So if I'm drawing a Venn diagram of public service and public health, working on public policy is that perfect sweet spot in between them. And I think similar to what Lisa and Jessica have said, you're able to bring in the experience that you've had as an advocate, but think about how can public policy work on a much larger population level to try and help benefit as many people as possible. And if I'm also thinking about it really from that public health perspective that I bring in, so many of our laws and policies really shape our beliefs and our values and our norms. And so if we have really good and thoughtful public policies that are shaping the norms in our community and are giving us a better idea of what we hold value to, then I think it only benefits us all.
Agreed. It is truly a sweet spot, and we're going to get into what some of those issues involved in that sweet spot are. So this call is sort of a reunion in that the three of you all recently got back from Washington, D.C., where you were attending National Advocacy Days hosted by the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. So for anyone who's not aware of these National Advocacy Days, how do you describe them, and what's the goal of the Advocacy Days?
Hot. It was hot.
Yeah,
in
it was
more
hot.
ways than one. There was a heat wave in DC is what I originally meant, but then I realized it could sort of have a double meaning.
So in addition to just being really hot and sweaty, what is the other meaning of how hot it is?
So, I mean, basically, we go with advocates from around the entire country, that everybody sort of convenes and descends upon DC at the same time, showing that there really is power in numbers and advocating for some of those common things that benefit all of the state coalitions and direct service providers.
Yeah.
Thank you all for going and putting up with the heat this year. Much appreciated. Lisa, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think also being able to give those, when you go in, it can't just talked earlier about those first days of going in to do legislative advocacy, and it can be intimidating when you are like, you're going in to meet with a legislator or their staff, and do I have the right words, and do I have command over the subject matter? Like, I know the importance at a direct service level, but can I articulate that into being able to describe the bill and the impact? And there were so many different things. So to be able to have, the staff from NNADV and NAESB, and we also had to be able to explain and give us some of those main talking points, but also the tips and the guidance on what's an effective way in order to be able to tell our story in a very succinct and precise and explicit way, to be able to draw it back and connect back to what's important to that particular legislator, thinking about how it impacts their constituents. One of the things that I enjoyed this year was they brought a panel of staffers from different legislators to hear their perspective, because generally that's who you're meeting with, is the staff, and to hear from them what was helpful, what was not helpful, what you could do for as far as follow-up, the type of information, how you go about presenting the information. So we got that first full day of preparation before we actually went out to do the visits. And so I think that was really important. And then it's great information that, I've got my notebook with my talking points that I can come back home and share that with advocates. And again, it's kind of like that ripple effect of being able to do legislative advocacy.
Well, that's so great that you had that kind of level of insight in order to prepare for your meetings with Congress. That seems really helpful.
Yep.
So when we're working with national policy change, often funding is an issue. And so I know you all were talking a lot about funding, and there's stuff going on with VOCA, with HUD, with RPE. And I was wondering, as we are talking about the importance of funding, if you could just give us kind of a brief overview of what's happening with federal funding for domestic and sexual violence advocacy services. How do you describe that? What does it look like right now?
Precarious.
Thank you.
I I say that jokingly, but also with real sincerity, is that, I think a big part of the conversation we were all having in DC is the precarious nature of funding right now. We're in a new Congress and a new administration. That administration put out a budget outline that looks very different than what we've seen in the past. And so I would say there were very genuine conversations whenever it was folks from the states and territories sitting in that room together for the prep day talking about if we do actually see really deep funding cuts in the core funding through VOCA, VAWA, FIPSA, what does that mean back in our communities? And that's where we really started to try and craft stories about if we were to lose a substantial part of the funding that we receive, here's what that means. We wouldn't be able to provide these specific services and programs to survivors and their families. We might have to cut programs and staff. So I think we spent a lot of time really talking about the importance of federal funding and having it stable, because that brings stability to our communities, knowing that they can depend on these services. It brings economic stability to the folks who work at those agencies and provide services and depend on that paycheck as well. So I think that was a lot of what we prepared for on that day before. And then I want to turn it over to Lisa and Jessica, because they did a great job in those meetings with our congressional delegation, telling those stories about here's the real world impact if we don't see that same level of support from our federal government.
Yeah, Lisa and Jessica, if you could speak to the power of telling stories and how you integrate it into your public policy advocacy, we would love to hear it.
I think it has always felt critical and important. This year it feels even more so. So like whatever is above critical, whatever is, higher risk than critical. Again, thinking about the entire state and not just St. Louis or Kansas City or Springfield, where maybe there are other resources, or yes, we would take a huge, huge hit if any of our big funding was, I want to say reduced. Quite frankly, the fear right now is it being eliminated. And I don't say that to cause fear, but I feel like this is not going to be like death by 1,000 cuts, as they say, but all of a sudden it'll just be gone. And I'm not trying to invoke panic because we're not there yet, but it's just, I think everybody realizes how important it is. Remembering when we're in those hallways that there's nothing partisan about this issue, that this is absolutely a bipartisan issue that everybody can get behind. I think we are seeing that with the Crime Victim Stabilization Act, which is to help, without getting too technical, help just support VOCA funding. At last count, there were over 200 co-sponsors, because I think people, when they hear the stories and they don't just sort of get the rhetoric and we can back it up. So we're not just saying we need this money and people will die if you don't give it to us, right? Which might be true. But we can back it up. We can share the story of somebody's mom, sister, daughter, niece, cousin, neighbor, right? These are not people that you don't know. This is happening to people that every single one of us know. You're in the grocery store at the same time as this woman. You're sitting next to her in church. Your kids go to school together, right? Really, really bringing that home. And even when you get, I don't even want to say pushback, because I don't know that we got pushback from anybody that we met with. Maybe people weren't ready to, jump on board with us yet, but they were willing to listen. And the more, I think that storytelling, that listening at least, has to go both ways. So when we are listening to that staffer say, here's why this particular congressperson is concerned, great. Tell us why they're concerned, because then it gives us time to think about that concern. Because I don't think anybody expects us to have an answer in that moment. But when you get back and you have that in-district meeting, or you're following up, you can do your homework and say, I heard your concern, and it's not something that I had thought of, but here's what I have thought about since then. And here's a couple potential scenarios of how we can address that. So it's always just like a good advocate does, trying to think 3-4 steps ahead. A lot of ways, policy work is just like a really good safety plan, right? We are constantly trying to minimize the risk.
I think that's a
I love that, Jessica.
I do
I am
too.
not going to forget
Well,
that
thank
one.
you.
And thinking about it, zeroing in on what's important to that legislator, and so we zeroed in, Matthew, talking about what's going to be the impact not only for programs and services, and what's going to happen to our workforce if jobs are eliminated or they're reduced in their hours. And so to be able to, if we had a legislator and we knew that their priority was workforce development and jobs, they're not going to want to lose jobs in their district. So we spoke to that, but we also spoke to that, if survivors served by our programs and emergency shelters and our housing programs, that one of the benefits, the outcomes of that is economic stability and rejoining the workforce. That was going to be a plus for them. A lot of the advocacy was filling in the gaps of knowledge that they may not be aware that potential cuts to the HUD continuum of care grants. And this is not just, that what does that mean? That means that domestic violence programs, I was surprised by the number of legislators that did not know that there were specific domestic violence bonus monies that went specifically for housing for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And so to be able to share that and to be able to talk about specific survivor stories of persons who came in through, emergency shelter, but went on into housing and how they were able to gain that not only housing stability, but economic stability through jobs. That was something that spoke to, it was a shared goal. And we just maybe had different ideas about how to be able to get to.
Yeah, I really like your point about connecting with legislators based on kind of what their interests are and how this would impact them, their family, their district. I think all of us that care deeply about advocacy do it with the survivors that we have worked with in mind each and every day. Like those faces, those names, those adorable children remain in our head as we do our advocacy work on every level. Because these issues impact real people and these stories of real people move policymakers. So thanks for speaking to that, y'all. You mentioned the Crime Victim Stabilization Act. Would you like to talk more about that? Explain it to listeners who maybe haven't heard of it or aren't familiar.
I've been sharing, both when we were in DC and since we've gotten back home, talking about the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act. I mean, I think it's a brilliant solution that, as Jessica said, has wide bipartisan support, just, to be able to give thanks to Missouri's own Ann Wagner for introducing that bill, and that we now have co-sponsors, again, bipartisan support in order to be able to have a fund that is, I tell people, it's not taxes. It's not raising taxes in order to be able to do this. This is taking monies from the False Claims Act that are fees collected for those that may defraud the government. So taking from bad actors and to be able to put it in a fund, and rather than those funds going directly into the U.S. Treasury, that it would go towards the Crime Victim Fund in order to be able to shore up those reserves of the Crime Victim Fund, VOCA, through fiscal year 2029. So it's a time-limited solution that doesn't use raising taxes in order to provide these life-saving and life-changing services. And so I think most, when we gave that information, it was great to be able to share that story, and I've shared it here with just, community partners, volunteers, whoever. It's like, oh, that makes sense, and that you could have this something that works and that you have the bipartisan support to be able to move forward with that. So it's something that will continue to, I would say, a top legislative priority for us.
And I think it meets that sweet spot, right? Like, it is time limited, which is huge to me. It's a fair ask, right? Like, we're not being greedy. We're not asking for more than we need. We can't justify, or we can justify every dime. And it's not taxes. So to me, it's a very, very smart strategy that when people really pay attention and read the fine print, like, there's no gotcha moments, right? Like, there's no like, oh yeah, what's also in here is XYZ that Congressman so-and-so may not agree with. It's very clear. It's easy to understand, and it makes sense. Again, bipartisan, time limited, not taxes. that's the sweet spot right there.
Love it. And I know we would all love to see some movement on that. Matthew, what would
Yes.
you add?
I think just to add a couple of things to that. One, I want to echo what Lisa said of thank you to Missouri's Congresswoman Ann Wagner. She led the VOCA fix back in 2019. That fix is working, but we also know that the VOCA fund needs some additional support. And this is a very pragmatic way of addressing that the VOCA fund needs some additional support. I think it's also really important to recognize that VOCA funds go to domestic and sexual violence service providers, but they're also going to child advocacy centers. They are going to prosecuting attorneys' offices. They're going to court-appointed special advocates. And so something that we've said a lot, both to members of our congressional delegation and to folks in Jefferson City, is we know that you care about public safety. And if crime is an issue that you care about, it means that you have to also care about victims of crime. And that's what this is doing, helping victims of crime. And that's something that, again, is very bipartisan, is a very pragmatic way of approaching a need for funding that doesn't involve taxes in any way. If you're already a bad actor who defrauded the government, well, then those fines and fees collected go to benefit victims of crime and their family.
Love it. Before we move on, is there anything else that really stands out to you about your trip to DC besides the extreme heat? Anything else you want to speak to or share with listeners?
You know, one of the kind of going back to the structure of the Public Policy Committee and how the coalition has evolved and responded to the changing needs of our programs, our member programs, and just the kind of like the legislative environment, was to be able to have the legislative firms, to be able to have one that's centered in Jefferson City to do those state level legislative advocacy, the lobbying. But then to be able to have Casey, who is up in DC, it was able, boots on the ground, so to speak, of legislative advocacy throughout the year. And how powerful that was is that she has already established connections with those key staffers and how it made our visits just so seamless. Everything from logistically figuring out how we only had to walk from one building to outside to another building that we could go because it was so hot. But more importantly, that she had already set up those meetings, made that contact. The staffers were already familiar with a lot of the things that we were going to be sharing. So we were able to provide a lot more detail, to be able to provide more stories. And that she's now there in Washington to be able to provide that follow-up, which again was one of those highlighted things that we heard from the panel of staffers. Of follow up with us, provide us more information, email that to us. Can you get this information back to us? And to be able to have Casey that is up there representing the coalition and its member programs, I think it's just such a strength of where we are now with our legislative advocacy.
I would echo that. So that was going to sort of be my takeaway was, because that's sort of a change for the coalition, right? Like to contract with lobbyists who is familiar both with Missouri as well as DC. And the part that made me really proud was to see how many of the other state coalitions were so impressed by what the Missouri coalition was doing, right? So I can't tell you guys how many people came up to Cheryl and Matthew and wanted Casey's information or wanted to hear more about the relationship and how it was working. Because it really is sort of a new and different way of doing things. It's sort of that strategy in action. Missouri's not always the first to do something, right? Or at least not something that we're proud of. But this coalition has been one of the first to do this. And I was really proud. I was really proud to be part of the Missouri coalition and hear some of that feedback and see the impact that it was having.
Big shout out to Casey. Thanks for your hard work in DC on behalf of Missouri. We certainly
And to the
appreciate it.
coalition, because
Right.
yes, the shout out for Casey, but Casey wouldn't be there if it wasn't for that leadership that had made that decision.
Yeah, it was just a
Matthew,
well-rounded
anything you would
team
add?
to be able to have the member program, Jessica and I representing member programs and public policy, Matthew and Cheryl, and then Casey. And we were able to share our stories from so many different angles. One of the other points that we advocated for and that Matthew and Cheryl spoke to was just the federal funding for state coalitions themselves. And that those are something that is in jeopardy as well. And to be able to, to step back and reflect upon the benefits that we have of a state coalition. Yes, it's the training and technical assistance, which is so valuable to all of our member programs and thinking about our leadership academy when we think about new leaders. But it's this legislative advocacy that can be organized by the coalition and how essential that is. And to be able to continue to receive that federal funding, it all goes hand in hand. And if we don't have that, if we don't have the voice to legislate and advocate for it, we're not going to have the funding. If we don't have the funding, we have no programs.
Absolutely. And hopefully when we are all working together and coordinated across the state of Missouri, we can achieve so much more. And that is hopefully the value of the coalition. Anything else you wanted to say, Matthew?
No, I think that all of that was very eloquently laid out, so nothing that I need to add to it.
Well, in addition to your work at the national level, you all also participated in Missouri Capital Advocacy Days hosted by the coalition. So how were your visits this year? They were much cooler in February, so not so much sweat. But how was Missouri Capital Advocacy Days this year? February is a long time ago.
Well, the opposite of DC, because it was a heat wave there, and I think we had maybe 2 snowstorms that caused us to have to reschedule.
That's right.
And
But I mean, I will say, yeah, but that's Missouri weather for you. If it is bad one week, wait until next week and it'll be completely different. And we certainly saw that happen. I will say that I was really proud of all of the folks who were able to attend Capital Advocacy Days this year. We had a really high number of participation, even with weather causing us to have to adjust and reschedule things, extend them out into March. But something that I think really stood out to me this year is we had a lot of freshman legislators who this was their first year in office, and they were really eager to meet with folks. They were really eager to have conversations and to work with other people in the legislature. So something that stood out for me was that, things in the last week of session did not turn out as we would have hoped, but leading up to that, people were really motivated to work together this year. And I felt like that was such a stark contrast to last year in 2024, where it felt like a really unproductive session, that people came in this year motivated, ready to work, ready to start working alongside other folks, listening to constituents, and really thinking about what are public policies that we need to be working on.
I don't think we can talk about this session without talking about Representative Cecily Williams and just her. I happened to be in Jeff City the day after she gave her testimony on the House floor, and everyone was still buzzing about it. They were bipartisan. Bipartisan, unanimous support after she told her story. And she was one of many legislators that told her story in different ways this year. And I think that speaks volumes to how much has changed in Jeff City. I don't know if a few years ago, women would have stepped forward and told their stories the way that they did. But her having the courage doesn't even seem like the right word, because it's so much more than courage. To me, it spoke to her integrity and her authentic self of getting up and telling that story and telling it in a way that forced people to listen. And they wanted to listen. I mean, it was a captive audience. What she said was amazing. How she said it was phenomenal. There's not enough words. I'm tearing up thinking about it. And it's been 6 months since she did it. It gives other women permission to tell their story, right? When you see somebody in a position of power who is putting herself out there, that she didn't know when she told that story it was going to be unanimous support. She didn't know when she told that story that she was even going to be believed, right? She didn't know that she wasn't going to be shamed or questioned or guilted. And she was a first year representative. I mean, there are no words. So you cannot talk about domestic violence in this session without mentioning that, and all of those women who supported her. openly, but I agree with Matthew. It felt different. I was able to get meetings with people that in the past I would have tried and tried and tried, and maybe they'd be in the office when I went through and have very real conversations. People seem open to learning. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do. I'm not going to pretend like, everything's like signed, sealed, and delivered. We've got a lot of work to do, but it feels like it's worth doing because it feels like, I mean, it's always worth doing, but it feels like it's worth doing because there's some things sort of coming into play and lining up or aligning the way we need them to. It's going to take time. It's not going to be easy. Advocacy is going to be more important than ever.
We're in
What
it
do you
for
do?
the marathon, not the sprint, right? Just to give a little bit of background information, Representative Williams was testifying on behalf of a bill that would have allowed women to get divorced while pregnant here in Missouri. And she told her story of how that would have impacted her as a survivor of domestic violence. And I think it speaks to some of that power of storytelling that you all were talking about earlier. When survivors tell their stories, when advocates tell their stories, when leaders tell their stories, it moves people and makes social change happen.
And the whole
Anything else you would
experience-
add, Lisa?
the experience for us, such a positive, powerful experience. And we went with a group members of Rosebrook Center's Legislative Advocacy Committee. And when I spoke earlier about, the importance of having those tenured, experienced leaders that have gone to these visits, but to be able to bring on newcomers to that so that they have that experience and that they can learn, just thinking about succession planning and expanding the depth and expanse of our reach, to have those, to bring along frontline advocates was so powerful. I think a powerful experience for them to be able to have that connection with the legislators who, I agree, ours were completely engaged, interested, had great questions, wanted to learn more, wanted to hear from the advocates. That instilled a sense of hope and optimism that when you're in the day to day, working with survivors and seeing the barriers and threats that they're facing can be disheartening. It can be, frustrating. It can be all of those things, but to be able to be there in the Capitol and to be able to hear, that there is a sense of, there is support and that there was bipartisan support for $25 million in general revenues. That is not happening in every other state. That they are showing that there is an importance and that they're opening to listening to these different public policy issues was so important that they can now bring that back into to share with their circle of influence about their experience and encourage others of, I've done it before, I've done it. And this is how it went. It was a great, and positive experience. You too can do it. I think that we can just, encourage more and more advocates that are willing to join us in public policy.
I agree wholeheartedly. Lisa, you spoke about some wins with appropriations, but we did have some other MOCADSV legislative priorities make it through the General Assembly and onto the governor's desk and get a signature. Could you all talk about what some of those legislative wins were?
Turn that over to Matthew.
Sure.
Summary of that.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. I do want to get started with talking about appropriations. I think that is a really important legislative win for us to celebrate, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Lisa. We were able to have the governor recommend $25 million in general revenue for VOCA. That's something that many other states are not seeing that same sort of support from their governor and from their legislature. So I also want to thank Representative Dirk Deaton. He is the House Budget Chair, and then Senator Lincoln Huff. He is the Senate Appropriations Chair. They have been huge supporters of ours in making sure that we do have level funding for domestic and sexual violence agencies. So a big thank you to the governor's office and both Representative Deaton and Senator Huff there. Along with that, we were able to see level state general revenue support for our domestic violence services line item, our sexual violence services line item. So again, it's really important to see that folks serving in our legislature understand the importance of putting general revenue toward supporting these services in Missouri communities. I also want to particularly thank Senators Tracy McCreary and Rick Bratton. This year, they picked up our priority of raising the age of marriage to 18 without any exceptions. I very much view that as a violence prevention bill. We know that we were hearing stories, particularly out of the Kansas City metro area, but plenty of other Missouri communities where young women were being coerced or forced into marriages. Missouri is now one of 16 states to ban that practice, and that's a really big deal. And I think it was such a good partnership between Senators McCreary and Bratton because Senator McCreary came in with data and facts and talking about when we raised the age from 14 a few years ago, we celebrated that, but it wasn't really 14-year-olds who were getting married. It was the 16 and 17-year-olds who were being forced or coerced into a marriage. And then Senator Bratton came in with a very pragmatic, emotional appeal of, as a father of 3 teenage daughters, I would never want them to be in this situation, and I would never want them to feel like they had to get married for one reason or another when they're still teenagers, when they're still children, you know? So it was a really great opportunity to work with both of them on that. And then I do want to go back to something that Jessica mentioned with Representative Cecily Williams. We weren't able to get the bill that would have allowed judges to finalize a divorce while a woman is pregnant all the way through this year. I do think it's really important that we recognize Representative Williams sharing her story. It really flipped the way that a lot of people thought about this particular issue. And it was because of her sharing her story that it was voted out of the House unanimously.
I mean, let that sink in for a second.
Yeah. So we see progress from one legislative session where it didn't even make it out of its committee to the next legislative session unanimously passing the House. And I think it's examples like that where we can see the impact of storytelling and exactly how we can connect over issues without it having to be about partisan politics. It's about supporting people and making sure that they know they have support and that they've been believed.
Other standout moments or successes you'd like to talk about from the 2025 legislative session?
Trying to think back.
A lot's happened since then.
A lot's happened.
And I will say that Matthew will be hitting the road with the MOCADSV Public Affairs team to provide trainings to MOCADSV members about developments in the law. Matthew, do you want to talk about those regional meetings coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. So the public affairs team will go out for our round of regional meetings soon. We'll do highlights of Missouri's legislative session, talk about some of the new laws that have passed and the impacts it will have on folks providing services, but also the impact on survivors and their family. We'll also highlight something that I'm really proud of us for getting started a couple of years ago, and it's our public policy exchange. We developed a public policy exchange with our neighboring states a couple of years ago because we recognize two things. One, many survivors need to relocate, and so if you are a survivor who maybe lived in Kentucky, but you needed to relocate to Missouri, it's really important that our Missouri advocates know any developments in law that are happening in those border states. I'm very, very proud of our public policy exchange that we've gotten started with our neighboring states because we do know that laws in one state impact folks who have to relocate and move from one state to another. But we also know that our state legislatures learn from each other. So if there's a public policy issue that passed in one of our neighboring states, it's very likely that our lawmakers here will take note of that and think, how might that play out in Missouri too? So there's a mutual benefit for us meeting with our neighboring states. And then something else that I'm really proud of that we got started is doing an overview of how you can implement public policy in your community. So talking about civic engagement as a public health and public policy issue. Now that we have these new laws, how are we educating our community partners and other community stakeholders to make sure that we're implementing them well, we're evaluating them to know that they work, and if there's anything that needs to be adjusted with a public policy, that advocates who are doing that work in local communities can communicate that back up to us on the state level.
Some listeners get in touch with their coalition to find out where those regional meetings will be at, and we would love to see you all there to continue this conversation about developments in the law. Lisa, in addition to your work at the state and federal level, you're also doing all kinds of great public policy work that has a big impact on survivors in Kansas City. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Sure. We finished up, Jackson County finished up their first domestic violence fatality review, published our report in 2024. And that was a second visit that we had to meet with state legislators, was to present the recommendations from that review. Again, it was, past legislation that was done to really support public government entities being able to be a part of it, of a fatality review, and to be able to protect the information that goes on within those discussions, to identify who would be a part of reviews that can take place anywhere across Missouri. But it allowed us an opportunity to be able to, it's part of the legislation to present those findings to the Missouri legislature, to the governor's office. So that was a great entryway to be able to those meetings with the leadership, with the governor's office, to present the recommendations. Our particular review looking at a domestic violence homicide, and it was a homicide suicide that we reviewed as part of our first review. Some key things that we spoke to legislators and the governor's office, one being consistent protocols for firearms relinquishment, and the other being to strengthen our legislation related to stalking and our coordinated community response to stalking. So going back to that visit with Representative Williams and thinking about our advocates who are seen on a day-to-day basis, the number of domestic violence crimes that involve a firearm, as well as an increased awareness on stalking and how that ties in with some of our lethality indicators. To be able to speak to and share that with Representative Williams, and to hear her say to us, hey, get back to me when you start drafting and crafting that legislation to strengthen stalking laws, let me know. I can be that person to help champion that. That was another huge win that we had. But we're taking particularly the firearms relinquishment, to be able to, again, it's an assessment of what are the gaps and how are we organized to do our work with firearms relinquishment, was that there's inconsistent ways in which we are using federal laws to be able to hold offenders accountable, to be able to get those firearms relinquished. And so now we've been able to take that information. We've recently presented that to the Missouri Supreme Court Commission on Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking. We've been meeting with law enforcement leaders, the Jackson County prosecutor, the mayor's office, again, to look to see where we can have community and statewide support to get, a bench card for judges on making those decisions about guidance on firearms relinquishment, being able to gain the support of free technical assistance that's provided by the National Center on Domestic Violence and Firearms, who will be able to present that, work with all of our law enforcement agencies and the prosecutor's office, again, to build out public policy and protocols so that we can have consistency here in Jackson County. And we're looking forward to, in October, to present on a MOPS conference webinar on lessons learned of what worked well, what didn't work so well, what will we do in our next review, and what can we share with other communities who are looking at doing a domestic violence fatality review.
Thanks for that explanation. And I really hope we see some positive changes from your recommendations. So thanks for all your hard work on that, Lisa. Jessica, anything you'd like to say about things happening in St. Louis?
Sure. St. Louis City also has the fatality review team. Our framework is a little bit different. So we have looked at several cases, not just one, with the hope of being able to identify trends. We're not at a report yet. And quite frankly, don't know when that is. I mean, there might be somebody that knows when that's coming. I don't know how close we are to publishing it. So that's one of the top 3 things that I think about when I think about what St. Louis is doing. So the fatality review team, and then we also have the Court Watch Project, which has been instrumental in really supporting a community response. So it started really as mostly the majority of the volunteers that were going into the courtrooms were by profession DV advocates, and it's really grown from that. So we have a lot of community volunteers now who are very interested in concrete ways they can help make change. So we have a core group of very dedicated volunteers that are going to dockets in St. Louis City. We are just in St. Louis City right now, just for some logistic reasons. And then typically somewhere between every 12 and 18 months, we take that data and make recommendations based on that data. That's changing a little bit right now. We're still collecting the data. The report might just look a little bit different, but that data is still there, which is very helpful, not just for the agencies, but also for the courts themselves and even the sheriff's department, for them to access funding and just be accountable to themselves and the community. And then I think the other thing, and maybe this is just on my mind right now because I testified in a trial last week, is about really trying to build up our team of expert witnesses who can testify. So really, it's not easy. It takes a lot of time. I'm waiting on a verdict as we speak. So maybe that's why it's at the top of mind right now. But to me, it's a whole nother way to advocate and help the jury understand. So the trial that I testified in last week, I think highlighted the importance. It was a murder case, and there were more, the defendant had more support in the courtroom than the victim did. There was one person there for the victim. And I think that right there, that paints a really terrible picture for the jury. The jury starts making assumptions about who that victim was and who did and didn't care about her. So I see it as an expert witness and an advocate's job to explain to the jury why victims make the decisions they do, and they might not always make sense to people that don't understand domestic violence. But when you have an expert witness working to educate the jury a little bit, it can help. So yeah, I think those are sort of the 3 things. And then just on top of really making a priority, and I know Matthew touched on this a little bit too, you don't have to go to Jeff City. You don't have to go to DC to advocate. I think those in-district meetings are especially important and useful. So remembering that as well.
Thanks for speaking to all those things, Jessica. And I could not agree more. I think we would love to see more expert witnesses on domestic and sexual violence throughout the state of Missouri. So if you're someone who is interested in becoming an expert witness, please get in touch with us at the coalition, and we can talk to you more about what that would entail. As we are winding down our conversation, I wanted to throw it back out to the 3 of you all. Were there any other thoughts you had about the intersection of domestic and sexual violence advocacy and public policy you wanted to be sure to speak to with our time together today?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the other lessons learned, or just one of the things that we discussed as a group for statewide legislative advocacy and going up to DC, that there may be a fatigue among legislators of hearing only from domestic violence and sexual violence, like the same leaders every time seeing those stories. And that really the difference of being able to hear directly from an advocate who is working directly with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, how important that is, to be able to lift up the voices of survivors, to be able to figure out ways in which we can center their voices and to have them be a part of our legislative work. We're looking at how do we combine our Survivor Advisory Board with our Legislative Advocacy Committee to be able to have the survivors that are a part of this messaging, but then also just, being able to recruit and engage our wider community in this voice to, they're representative of the constituents for all of the legislators. So how can we, and I think that both of these experiences, both from the coalition and the work that National Network to End Domestic Violence and NAESV did in really distilling the information and making it manageable, plain language, was really helpful, that we can share that with other people who are interested in. And I think that we've got, with the Public Policy Committee, I think we have several members who are willing and ready to be able to mentor those advocates and community members who want to give voice to this.
Absolutely. So Jessica, I'm hearing you say, don't be afraid. Lisa, you're saying use your voice. Anything else you want to end on, Matthew?
Yeah, just really briefly, I think to add on to what both Jessica and Lisa said, it reminded me of something that I heard Colleen say many years ago, which is just that public policy is very much a team sport because it can be competitive, but it requires really good communication and cooperation. And that stuck with me because I am not someone who ever played sports growing up. I'm not a big sports fan or athlete, but I think that sentiment really resonates that public policy is a team sport. And I think exactly what Jessica and Lisa said. You don't have to be afraid of it because there are other people there to help you. And it's something that can really lift you up and be really empowering too.
Thank you so much, you all, for those just wonderful words of insight. And we really appreciate all the work that you do in your local communities and at the state level and federal level to move positive public policy forward. So thank you also for joining me on the podcast today. We certainly appreciate it. I want to give a special shout out to Matthew Huffman, who had the idea to found this podcast several years ago and launched as a project that continues today. So it really is an honor to have you on the podcast for that reason as well, Matthew. Thanks for all that you do, everyone. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next month for a new episode of Momentum for Change. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.